What we are witnessing tonight is not a routine quarrel between neighbors, not another noisy episode in the endlessly theatrical politics of North America, and not a temporary burst of nationalist posturing that will fade with the next news cycle. This is something far more consequential. Canada's counterattack against Donald Trump's pressure campaign, shaped and sharpened by Mark Carney's strategic discipline, has exposed a hard truth at the center of the Western order. Coercion from the largest power in the alliance system no longer guarantees submission from those long assumed to have no choice but to comply, and that changes the meaning of power itself. What appeared at first glance to be a familiar display of American leverage has instead become a demonstration of American overreach, and what was intended as pressure on Ottawa has begun to look dangerously like a self-inflicted wound in Washington. The headline, on its surface, is dramatic enough. Trump applies pressure. Canada refuses to bend. Carney responds not with panic, not with theatrical outrage, but with a calibrated counterstroke that transforms vulnerability into leverage. Yet the real story lies beneath that sequence. The real story is that the old assumptions have begun to fail in public. For decades, the structural logic seemed obvious. When the United States bears down on a smaller economy, especially one as deeply integrated as Canada's, the smaller state absorbs the shock, makes concessions, and preserves the relationship at any cost. That was the expected script. It was the logic of asymmetry. It was the logic of dependence. It was the logic of an empire that rarely needed to call itself one. But this time that logic encountered resistance, backed by competence, by credibility, and by a strategic understanding of where America itself had become exposed. That is where Carney matters, not simply as a politician, and not merely as a national leader responding to a bilateral dispute, but as a figure uniquely equipped to understand the architecture of modern power. He is not a pure partisan combatant. He is not a creature of cable television or campaign slogan. He comes from the world of central banking, financial stability, sovereign credibility, market psychology, institutional signaling. He understands what many political tacticians do not, that in the 21st century, pressure is never just pressure. It is also information. It tells markets who is reckless. It tells allies who is dependable. It tells capital where risk is rising. It tells the world whether a government is playing for leverage or merely for applause. And once that signal goes out, it does not stop at the border. So what happened here was not simply that Canada answered American pressure. It was that Canada answered it in a way that redefined the battlefield. Trump's method, as always, relies on brute visibility. Escalate, threaten, personalize, dominate the narrative by making politics feel like combat and diplomacy feel like humiliation. It is a style built on intimidation and momentum. It works best when opponents react emotionally, fragment internally, or scramble for exemptions, while the spectacle of power does the rest. But that model has a weakness, and Carney identified it with remarkable clarity. The weakness is that a pressure campaign assumes the initiator can absorb the consequences of escalation better than the target. If that assumption is wrong, then pressure ceases to be strength. It becomes exposure. Canada's answer in that sense was not powerful because it was loud, it was powerful because it was structurally intelligent. It did not need to overpower the United States in raw economic mass. That was never possible. It needed to make the cost of coercion visible, immediate, and politically difficult for Washington to ignore. It needed to demonstrate that integrated supply chains cut both ways, that retaliatory pressure can travel upstream into American manufacturing, downstream into consumer prices, and sideways into investor confidence. It needed to show that interdependence is not charity from the strong to the weak. It is mutual vulnerability. And once mutual vulnerability becomes politically weaponized by the smaller player more effectively than by the larger one, the psychological balance of the conflict changes with astonishing speed. This is why the phrase counterattack is not rhetorical excess, it is analytical precision. Canada did not merely defend. Defense would have meant minimizing damage, seeking private concessions, and hoping the storm passed. What Carney's posture signaled instead was something far more ambitious, that Ottawa intended to turn America's pressure campaign into an argument against the pressure campaign itself. That is the highest form of strategic inversion. It means using an adversary's chosen instrument as evidence of his own strategic misjudgment. It means forcing the initiator to explain why allies are now hedging, why investors are now calculating political risk inside the United States, why firms are now rethinking concentration, and why the domestic costs of nationalist escalation are arriving faster than the promised gains. In other words, it means making the punishment of Canada look and feel like the destabilization of America. And the significance extends well beyond tariffs, trade barriers, or retaliatory measures. This is not only about what crosses a border, it is about what governs a system. Trump's worldview is transactional, immediate, and coercive. It treats alliances as billing disputes, institutions as constraints, and credibility as a secondary matter compared to dominance in the moment. Carney's response operates from the opposite premise. It assumes that long-term advantage comes not just from material power, but from trust, predictability, and the ability to organize coalitions around a perception of seriousness. That contrast is crucial. One side is trying to extract concessions through shock. The other is trying to convert shock into alignment, resilience, and legitimacy. One side is playing for submission. The other is playing for systemic position. This is where the public narrative diverges sharply from the real one. Publicly, the confrontation can be presented as a bilateral clash between a nationalist American strongman and a defiant Canadian leadership trying to protect domestic interests. That is the surface image. Beneath it lies a much more profound contest over whether middle powers can survive the age of erratic giants by becoming smarter, faster, and more than the empires around them expect. Canada in this confrontation is not just Canada, it is a test case. If Ottawa can absorb pressure, redirect it, and emerge with greater strategic autonomy, other countries will study that model with extraordinary attention. Not because they wish to confront Washington, but because they increasingly feel they may one day need to withstand it. And that is why this story has alarm bells far beyond North America. In Europe, in the Indo-Pacific, in every capital that depends on the United States, while also fearing the volatility of its politics. This episode is being read as a warning and a lesson. The warning is that American pressure under Trump does not necessarily distinguish between adversaries and allies if domestic theatrical advantage demands escalation. The lesson is that resistance, if grounded in competence rather than emotion, can produce strategic dividends. This is a dangerous revelation for Washington because hegemony relies not only on strength but on consent. When allies begin quietly preparing for coercion from the patron, the alliance system has entered a different historical phase. It may still endure, but it no longer operates on innocence. There is also a domestic dimension inside the United States that makes this more than a foreign policy embarrassment. Trump's political method has always depended on presenting complexity as weakness and disruption as proof of resolve. But international economics is an unforgiving arena for performative force. A pressure campaign that destabilizes integrated industries, spooks markets, and raises uncertainty across cross-border sectors does not remain a foreign story for long. It becomes an American business story, an American inflation story, an American supply chain story, and ultimately, an American electoral story. Carney, with the instincts of a crisis manager rather than a culture warrior, appears to understand that the surest way to blunt Trump's aggression is not to answer his rhetoric on its own terms, but to make his tactics materially expensive for the constituencies he claims to defend. This is the deeper disaster for America. Not that it faces retaliation, great powers often do. The real disaster is that its pressure has ceased to look strategically efficient. It is one thing for a superpower to impose costs. It is another for it to do so in ways that advertise its own impatience, narrow its options, and convince partners that political turbulence in Washington is now itself a central global risk variable. That reputational cost is difficult to quantify, but profoundly important. Capital notices it, diplomats notice it, defense planners notice it, corporate boards notice it. Once the image of American statecraft shifts from formidable to erratic, every negotiation changes tone, every alliance conversation acquires a hedge, every dependency begins to look like a liability to be managed, rather than a foundation to be deepened. And yet, perhaps the most remarkable feature of this moment is the manner in which Canada has reframed itself. For years, Canada's strategic identity has often been narrated in modest terms: stable, polite, pragmatic, prosperous but secondary, useful but not decisive, secure but largely because geography and alliance spared it the harsher realities of geopolitical competition. That image now looks outdated. Under pressure, Canada has presented another face altogether. Disciplined, technically literate, institutionally serious, and capable of leveraging its integration with the United States as a source of bargaining power rather than permanent dependence. That does not make Canada a great power in the classical sense, but it does make it something increasingly important in a disordered world, a high-functioning strategic state. That distinction matters. The 21st century may not belong entirely to the largest states. It may, in critical moments, reward states that know how to convert networks into leverage, law into shield, credibility into deterrence, and economic interdependence into reciprocal risk. Carney's importance, then, is not just that he answered Trump. It is that he did so in a language the future may increasingly speak. Not the language of raw intimidation, but the language of institutional endurance under pressure. Not the language of spectacle, but the language of strategic sequencing. Not the language of emotional reaction, but the language of calibrated consequence in a world crowded with maximalists and improvisers. That can be a devastating advantage. Of course, none of this means Canada is invulnerable. That would be fantasy, and dangerous fantasy at that. The asymmetry remains real. The United States remains the dominant economic, military, and financial power in the relationship. It retains escalation dominance in many domains. Canada cannot outspend, outshout, or outthreaten Washington. But that is precisely why this episode matters so much. It shows that in an age of deep interdependence, dominance does not eliminate fragility. Power can still be clumsy. Size can still create blind spots. A larger state can still misread the political economy of its own coercion. And when it does, a smaller state with sufficient intelligence, patience, and credibility can force a strategic correction far more effectively than conventional power rankings would suggest. There is another layer here, and it is psychological. Trump's political project has always depended on the image of inevitability. He thrives on the perception that resistance collapses, that institutions bend, that opponents eventually retreat, and that even allies must calculate around his appetite for escalation. That image is not a cosmetic asset. It is central to his method. Once adversaries or partners begin to demonstrate that pressure can be absorbed and redirected, the mythology of inevitability weakens. That is why a disciplined counterattack is so dangerous to a politics built on dominance. Theater, it punctures the aura. It does not merely deny a concession, it raises the possibility that the strongman can be maneuvered into overplaying his hand. Once that possibility becomes thinkable, it spreads. And it spreads because the world is watching a larger pattern unfold. The post-Cold War era trained many states to believe that access to the American system required a high tolerance for unilateral American behavior. That bargain held so long as the benefits outweighed the volatility. But the volatility has risen. Trump did not create every structural doubt surrounding the United States, but he intensified them with extraordinary force. Questions once whispered in ministries and boardrooms are now openly asked. How durable are American commitments? How political are American market decisions? How quickly can alliance relationships become hostages to domestic spectacle? How much exposure is too much exposure? Canada's response does not answer those questions for everyone, but it legitimizes asking them, and that alone is a geopolitical event. The financial dimension should not be underestimated. Carney comes from a world where credibility is not an abstraction, but a tradable premium. Markets punish incoherence. They punish volatility when volatility appears endogenous to politics. They punish governments that mistake short-term tactical aggression for sustainable strategy. If Canada's response has succeeded in recasting Trump's pressure as a source of North American instability rather than American control, then the implications move rapidly beyond customs desks and trade ministries. They enter currency expectations, investment timing, capital allocation, energy planning, and sovereign risk interpretation. That is where modern geopolitical contests become truly serious. Not when leaders exchange insults, but when uncertainty alters behavior across entire systems of production and finance. And then there is the alliance question. Perhaps the most delicate of all, the United States does not lead the West only because it is strong. It leads because others, most of the time, believe American leadership is preferable to fragmentation. That belief's on confidence that Washington, whatever its internal political changes, will not casually weaponize interdependence against trusted partners in ways that force them into strategic self-protection. If that confidence erodes, the consequences may not appear immediately dramatic. No allied flag will necessarily come down. No instant rupture will occur. The change is subtler and therefore more important. Countries begin diversifying suppliers. They deepen regional fallback arrangements. They cultivate alternative diplomatic channels. They harden legal protections. They treat American reliability not as a constant, but as a fluctuating variable. That is how hegemonic systems thin out from within. From that perspective, Canada's counterattack is historically significant, not because it defeats the United States, but because it reveals the cost of America treating leadership as coercive entitlement. Empires often believe pressure proves authority. In reality, pressure reveals authority only when used with discrimination and strategic purpose. Used recklessly, it reveals insecurity. Used theatrically, it reveals a vanity. Used against close partners without adequate regard for systemic consequences, it reveals a dangerous confusion between dominance and order. Carney's achievement has been to expose that confusion in real time. He has shown that Trump's method can create precisely the conditions it claims to prevent: uncertainty, resistance, diversification, and the slow corrosion of American-centered stability. The political symbolism inside Canada is equally important. Nations often discover their strategic identity not in comfort, but under stress. When pressure arrives from a larger neighbor, the smaller state can fracture, appease, or consolidate. By turning the confrontation into a test of competence and sovereignty rather than panic and victimhood, Carney has elevated the dispute beyond transactional politics. He has made it a statement about national agency that matters because external coercion often produces internal clarity. It sharpens elite consensus. It mobilizes institutions. It rewrites public expectations. A country long presumed to be constrained by geography can, under the right leadership, begin acting as though strategy is not something done to it, but something it does. That shift in self-conception can outlast the immediate crisis by years. And still, the larger truth remains. This episode is not just about Canada becoming stronger. It is about the United States appearing less strategically disciplined than its power should allow. That is a far more serious development. Great powers can survive failed tactics. They can survive diplomatic backlash. They can survive episodes of overreach. What they cannot easily survive is the normalization of the belief that their own behavior is now a major source of systemic instability. Once that belief takes hold among allies, investors, and rival powers simultaneously, every future move becomes harder. Every warning is discounted. Every demand invites hedging. Every attempt at pressure risks triggering preparation rather than compliance. In that environment, even enormous power begins to generate diminishing strategic returns. This is why the phrase "turned America's pressure into a disaster" is more than rhetorical drama. The disaster is not simply policy setback, it is strategic inversion. It is the moment when a campaign designed to reaffirm hierarchy instead exposes the liabilities of hierarchy exercised without discipline. It is the moment when a supposed target becomes the more credible actor in the eyes of external audiences. It is the moment when the initiator of pressure appears tactically aggressive but strategically short-sighted, while the recipient appears vulnerable, yet ultimately more composed, more coherent, and more capable of operating at the level of consequences rather than emotion. That reversal is rare.
When it happens, it resonates far beyond the immediate dispute. What follows now may be even more important than what has already happened, because once a major ally has demonstrated that resistance is possible, the strategic environment changes for everyone. Future American pressure campaigns will be studied through this precedent. Foreign governments will ask whether escalation can be boomeranged. Domestic industries will ask whether political theater is worth supply disruption. Markets will ask whether volatility is becoming a structural feature of American diplomacy, and rivals of the United States will watch carefully for opportunities to exploit every new crack in Western cohesion. None of this means America is finished, far from it, but it does mean that the margin for careless power has narrowed, and narrowed visibly. There is a final irony here, and it is an important one. Trump's politics promised restoration through force. It promised that toughness can rewind structural change, that pressure can replace persuasion, that dominance can be recovered through confrontation alone. But the world that approach confronts is not the world of a simpler century. It is a world of networks, dependencies, reputations, and interlocking vulnerabilities. In such a world, force without strategic literacy does not restore control. It disperses risk. It invites counter-coalitions. It teaches others to adapt. Carney appears to have understood that before many in Washington did. He read the map more clearly. He saw that the route from pressure to disaster was shorter than Trump imagined, and he guided the confrontation onto that road. So tonight's story is not merely that Canada stood up to Trump. It is that a medium-sized ally, led by a man fluent in the mechanics of systemic power, may have exposed a larger fracture within the American order itself. The issue is not who won a day's news cycle. The issue is whether coercion has begun to consume the credibility that made American leadership possible in the first place. If that is what this moment represents, then we are not watching a bilateral dispute. We are watching a warning flare over the architecture of the West. Canada's counterattack has revealed that pressure can rebound, that asymmetry can mislead, and that in an age of volatility, the side that best understands systems may prevail over the side that believes volume is enough. And as that is true, then the full meaning of this confrontation has not yet arrived. It is still moving outward through markets, through alliances, through institutions, through strategy itself. The shock is here. The consequences are still